I can see you've uploaded 2 text files. Let me take a look at them to understand what you'd like me to help you with. I'll now write the story based on your source material and detailed instructions. Starting round 1 to 10,500 words. What would you do if, in the dead of winter, alone in the mountains, you heard 3 knocks at your door, and when you opened it, there stood 2 creatures soaking wet, shivering, terrified, not quite human, not quite animal? Would you let them in? In the winter of 1991, a widow named Martha Goodwin opened her cabin door to find 2 young Bigfoot, lost and desperate in a blizzard. She took them in, fed them, gave them warmth. She had no idea this simple act of kindness would awaken an ancient debt owed to her family, a promise made 2 decades earlier when her late husband saved one of their children. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bigfoot? Really? But here's the thing, this story isn't about proving anything exists. It's about what happens when we choose compassion over fear, when we open the door instead of bolting it shut. Based on American folklore and accounts that have never been published until now, this is what happened in Cedar Hollow, Montana, a tale of trust exchanged through honey bread and cedar wreaths, of silent guardianship, of a bond between species that defied everything Martha thought she knew about the world. You'll discover the meaning behind the braided cedar ring, a symbol older than memory, why 3 knocks echo through the forest each night, and how a lonely woman became part of something once thought only myth. When Martha found an old tin box behind her fireplace, she uncovered her husband's journal, proof of the connection that started it all. A jar of honey, a rescued child, a circle of protection, 20 years in the making. If you skip ahead, you might miss the moment everything changed, because sometimes what we save in a heartbeat of compassion is what will save us for the rest of our lives. So like this video, subscribe to the channel, and settle in. Because Martha Goodwin's winter was about to become something she'd never forget, assuming she survived it. The wind outside had teeth. That's the only way to describe it. It bit through the gaps in the window frames, found the spaces between the logs, settled into the bones of the cabin like it planned to stay all winter. Inside, everything was still except for the soft tick of coal burning in the stove. The flames pulsed behind the iron grate, throwing shadows across the wooden walls, across the yellowed photographs, across the frayed quilt folded over the rocking chair. Martha Goodwin sat alone at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of chicory coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. 68 winters behind her, and this one still found new ways to get under her skin. She watched the snow pile higher outside the window, the glass fogging with her breath and memory. The cold out there was the kind that killed. 30 below, maybe worse. The kind of cold that made your lungs ache just thinking about it. The old oil lamp hissed beside her, casting amber light across the cluttered tabletop. A worn Bible lay open near her elbow, its cover cracked like old leather, spine held together with duct tape Frank had applied before he died. Inside the front cover, in faded script only she could read without her glasses anymore, were words her late husband had carved with his penknife the winter before the cancer took him. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. She ran her fingers across the letters now, slowly, as if they were still warm from his hands. Her eyes moved from the page to the mantel above the stove, where a black and white photo of her son Danny stared out. Taken on his 10th birthday, right before the Yellowstone River took him, his smile was all teeth and freckles, one front tooth still crooked. He'd have been 42 now, would have had kids of his own, probably. Grandkids she'd never meet. The room was warm enough, 70 degrees, according to the thermometer Frank had nailed beside the door, but her bones weren't. There was a cold that lived in the spaces between memories, the kind no stove could touch. Then it came, one knock, sharp, hollow, clear. She froze. The mug trembled against the wood. Another knock, lower, heavier, like something big, shifting its weight. Her breath caught, and then a third, softer this time, but deliberate, like an echo or a choice. She sat there for a moment, not blinking. Somewhere deep in her chest, her heartbeat picked up, but not from fear. Not exactly. It was something else. A pull, a recognition she couldn't name. Her hand reached automatically for the shotgun. Frank kept behind the door, loaded, always loaded, because that's how you survived out here. Her fingers grazed the stock, then stopped. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. "Frank," she whispered to the empty room, to the photo on the mantel, to the ghost that still lived in the spaces between the furniture. "I hear you." She unlatched the bolt. The door creaked open slow, fighting against her like the house itself wasn't sure this was a good idea. Snow spiraled in on the wind, swirling past her slippers and across the pine floorboards like startled birds. The cold hit her face like a slap, made her eyes water. And there, just beyond the pale circle of porch light, huddled on the top step, were two shapes. Small, hunched, covered in dark, matted hair that dripped melting snow. They were soaked through fur or skin, she couldn't tell, and their bodies shook with cold that went beyond what any living thing should endure. The taller one had its hand gripped tight on the smaller one's shoulder, like it was the only thing keeping either of them upright. Steam rose from their backs where the body heat met the freezing air. The smaller of the two held something in both hands. A cedar branch. It wasn't broken or torn. It had been chosen, cut clean at the base, twisted carefully with what looked like dried grass or moss. The needles were fresh, still green, and it was being offered to her like a gift, like a prayer. They didn't make a sound, didn't move toward her, just stood there in the bitter wind, looking up at her with eyes that held something she recognized, something human, even if the rest of them wasn't. Terror, desperation, hope. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror, the day they pulled Danny's body from the river, the day the doctors told Frank there was nothing more they could do, the day she'd buried him 6 feet down, in ground so frozen they'd had to use a backhoe. She should have closed the door, should have stepped back, grabbed that shotgun, called Sheriff Rawlings, even though he was 40 miles away and the roads were impassable. Should have acted like someone who'd lived alone in these mountains long enough to know better than to trust anything that came out of the woods after dark. But instead, she stepped aside. "Come on in," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hoarse, uncertain, but somehow certain too. "You'll freeze out there." They didn't speak, just shuffled in slowly, tracking slush and mud across the old floorboards Frank had laid down himself back in '63. She shut the door behind them, and the wind howled once more on the other side like it had lost its chance. She led them to the hearth, tossing 2 fresh logs into the stove, coaxing the fire until it breathed hotter, brighter. Steam began to rise from their soaked fur, filling the room with a smell like wet dog mixed with something wild pine sap, earth, musk. Their shapes, hunched low and tucked tight, seemed less monstrous in the firelight, almost childlike in their stillness, in their trust. Martha moved to the cedar chest by the wall and pulled out a clean towel and Frank's old army blanket, the wool one he'd carried through Korea. The small one took the towel, hesitated like it didn't quite know what to do with it, then wrapped it around its shoulders. The taller one just watched her movements carefully, memorizing her, learning her. In the kitchen, Martha cut thick slices of bread from the loaf she'd baked that morning, slathered them with honey from the jar she kept in the cupboard, local honey, the kind old Pete Whitmore, brought by once a month from his hives. She brought the plate back and set it on the floor near the fire, then stepped back slowly. No sudden movements. Same way you'd approach a wounded deer or a dog that's been kicked too many times. They fell on the food like they were starving. No sound except breathing, chewing, the quiet pop and hiss of the stove. The small one finished first, then curled up on the braided rug, still clutching that cedar branch to its chest like a child's blanket. The taller one watched Martha for another long moment, then settled beside the smaller one, head resting on its companion's shoulder. Both sets of eyes, dark, deep, impossibly aware, closed slowly. Sleep came fast. The kind of sleep that only comes after you've been holding out for so long you didn't think you'd make it. Martha sat in her rocking chair across the room, the quilt pulled over her lap, and just watched them. The chair creaked softly as she rocked, a rhythm that matched the tick of burning coal. Her eyes drifted to the folded quilt on the back of the couch, the same one she'd wrapped around Danny that day by the creek, trying to warm a body that would never be warm again. "You were so cold," she said softly, not to them, not even to herself, just to the memory of a boy who never got to grow up. "I don't want anybody to feel that cold, not if I can help it." Outside, the storm screamed on. But inside the little cabin, the fire held, the walls held, and somewhere, deep in the bones of the house, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, something old and sacred stirred awake. 3 knocks. Not just a sound anymore. A choice. A test. Maybe even a promise. Martha didn't know what she'd just let into her home. Didn't know the story that had started 20 years ago, or the debt that was about to be paid. But she knew this much. She wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes, on a night when the cold has teeth and the wind won't stop screaming, that's enough. The snow didn't quit. All through that long night it fell thick and heavy, covering the Bitterroot Mountains in silence, so complete it felt like the world had ended and they were the only things left alive. By morning, the drifts were chest-high against the porch rail. The trees wore coats of white that bent their branches low. Even the wind had given up, exhausted from all that, howling. Inside, Martha woke to find them gone. Not gone, just moved. The taller one sat by the window, watching the dawn break pink and gold over the ridgeline. The smaller one was curled near the stove, still wrapped in Frank's army blanket, that cedar branch tucked under one arm. Martha's joints complained as she stood, arthritis in her hips, her knees, her damn fingers, but she moved quiet to the kitchen and started the coffee. The percolator bubbled and hissed, filling the cabin with a smell that meant morning, meant routine, meant life goes on, even when nothing makes sense anymore. She made oatmeal. Not the instant kind, the real kind that takes 20 minutes and needs salt and butter to taste like anything. While it cooked, she kept glancing at them. They hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, just sat there like they were waiting for permission. "Breakfast," she said finally, keeping her voice low, gentle. "You're probably hungry." The taller one's head turned. Its eyes, his eyes. She corrected herself, because something about the way he held himself said male met hers. There was intelligence there, understanding. He stood slowly, unfolding to a height of maybe 6.5 feet, and moved to wake the smaller one with a touch so careful it made Martha's throat tight. She ladled the oatmeal into bowls, drizzled more honey on top, set them on the table. They approached cautiously, sitting on the floor beside the chairs rather than in them. Smart, she thought. They know what furniture means. Know they're too big for it. Know the difference between guest and intruder. They ate slowly this time, not with yesterday's desperation. The younger one, and Martha was certain now it was young, maybe the equivalent of a 10 or 12-year-old human child, kept looking at her between bites. Not afraid, curious. The way Danny used to look at her when he was trying to figure out if he could get away with something. "Where did you come from?" Martha asked, not expecting an answer but needing to fill the silence with something. "Where's your family?" The taller one paused, spoon wouldn't spoon, because Martha didn't trust them with metal yet halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, then pointed out the window. North, up into the high country where the mountains got mean and the trees grew so thick, you could walk 20 feet and disappear completely. "You got lost in the storm," Martha said. It wasn't a question. The taller one nodded. "Once. Deliberate. Well." Martha wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, feeling the warmth seep into her aching knuckles. "Storm's not done. Radio said we got another 3 days of this coming. You're welcome to stay till it clears." She should have been terrified, should have been calling for help, locking doors, loading that shotgun. But Frank's words kept circling in her head. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. These two had knocked. She'd answered. And now here they were, sitting in her kitchen eating oatmeal like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, neither strange nor comfortable, but somewhere in between. The creatures, she refused to call them Bigfoot, even in her own head. It felt disrespectful, somehow stayed mostly near the fire. The younger one, who Martha started thinking of as Little Cedar because of that branch it wouldn't let go, seemed fascinated by everything. The photographs on the walls, the way light moved across the floor as the day wore on, the tick-tick-tick of the old clock above the mantel. The taller one, though he watched Martha, not in a threatening way, in a measuring way, like he was trying to figure out who she was, what she was made of, whether the kindness was real or just some trick that would snap shut like a trap. On the third day, Martha was at the sink washing dishes when she felt him behind her. Close enough she could smell that wild scent pine and earth, and something older, something that had no name. Her heart kicked, but she didn't turn around, didn't flinch. "Need something?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. A pause, then a sound, low, guttural. Not quite words, but not animal either. Something in between, like language filtered through a throat not quite built for it. She turned slowly. He stood there, towering over her even though he was hunched, trying to make himself smaller. In his massive hands, hands that could probably snap her neck without effort, he held her empty coffee mug, the blue ceramic one Frank had given her for their 30th anniversary, chipped at the rim where she'd dropped it once, glued back together with epoxy that had yellowed with age. He set it gently on the counter, then touched his chest, then pointed at her. "Thank you." The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that Martha felt something crack open inside her chest, some part of her that had been frozen since Frank died, since Danny drowned, since she'd learned that loss was just the price you paid for daring to love anything in this world. "You're welcome," she whispered. His eyes held hers for another moment, dark eyes, deep as wells, old as mountains, and then he nodded and moved back to the fire, where Little Cedar was watching them both with what could only be described as hope. That night, after they'd eaten dinner venison stew Martha had made from the deer she'd shot in November, vegetables from her root cellar, bread she taught Little Cedar how to braid before baking, Martha pulled out Frank's old atlas, the kind with real paper pages, showing every mountain range and river and forgotten dirt road in Montana. She spread it on the floor near the fire, and the two creatures leaned in close, their breath fogging the lamplight. Martha pointed to Cedar Hollow, the little valley where her cabin sat, barely marked on the map. Then she pointed north, into the white spaces where the cartographers had given up trying to name things. "That's where you need to go?" she asked. The taller one studied the map for a long time, his finger thick as her wrist, with a nail more like a claw hovering over the ridges and valleys. Finally, he touched a spot maybe 15 miles north. High country, rough country. The kind of place you didn't go unless you were running from something or looking to disappear. "That's home," Martha said. He nodded. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. You could leave then." But even as she said it, something in her chest tightened. These 3 days had been strange. Yes. Impossible. Yes. But they'd also been the first days since Frank died that she hadn't felt like she was drowning in silence. The cabin felt alive again, full again, like it remembered what it meant to hold more than just ghosts. The taller one must have seen something in her face, because he reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her shoulder. Just rested his hand there for a moment, that massive palm warm and solid, and somehow gentle, a gesture that needed no translation. "I understand. I know what loneliness weighs. I know what it costs to let people leave." Martha covered his hand with hers, her wrinkled fingers barely spanning half his palm. "You'll come back though, won't you?" She didn't know why she asked. Didn't know why it mattered. "If you need to." He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. But something passed between them in that moment. Some understanding older than words. Some promise that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be real. The storm broke the next morning like a fever. The sun came out hard and bright, turning the snow to diamonds, the air so cold and clear it hurt to breathe. Martha packed them food for the journey bread, dried meat, a jar of honey she could spare. She wrapped it in cloth and tied it with twine, her hands shaking slightly, though she couldn't say why. They stood at the door, ready to leave. Little Cedar looked up at Martha, those impossibly old eyes in that young face, and carefully laid the cedar branch on the table. A gift, a thank you, a piece of itself left behind. Then they were gone, disappearing into the tree line like they'd never been there at all. Like maybe Martha had imagined the whole thing. Except for the tracks in the snow, massive, deep, unmistakable, and the cedar branch on her table, still green, still fresh, smelling like the deep woods and promises made in silence. Martha stood on the porch long after they'd vanished, watching the tree line, feeling the cold seep through her sweater. The cabin behind her was empty again, silent again, full of ghosts and memories, and all the loneliness she'd thought she'd learned to carry. But now it felt heavier. Because for 3 days, she'd remembered what it felt like to not be alone, and remembering, she knew now, was sometimes worse than never knowing at all. She went inside, made coffee, sat at the table. The cedar branch lay where little Cedar had left it, and Martha picked it up slowly, running her fingers over the needles, feeling the life still in it. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. I answered, Frank, she whispered to the empty room. I answered. So what happens now? The cabin didn't answer, but somewhere outside, far up in the high country, 3 knocks echoed through the trees. Clear, deliberate, purposeful. 1, 2, 3. And Martha Goodwin, 68 years old, arthritic and alone and still standing, felt something stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but not despair either. Something in between. Something that felt like the beginning of a story instead of the end of one. Now here's where it gets weird. Well, weirder. Because if you think 3 days hosting Bigfoot in your cabin is strange, wait till you hear what Martha found 2 weeks later. She'd been cleaning. The kind of deep cleaning you do in late winter when cabin fever's setting in, and you need something, anything to keep your hands busy, and your mind from circling the drain. She was moving the old rocking chair away from the wall to sweep behind it when she heard it. A hollow sound, wrong somehow. She knocked on the wall, solid. Knocked again, 2 feet over, hollow. What the hell? Martha muttered, running her hands over the pine boards Frank had installed back in. When was it? 1967. Right after they'd bought the place. Before Danny was born. When they'd thought they had forever. Her fingers found it. A seam, so fine you'd never notice unless you were looking, unless you were touching. A panel, maybe 2 feet square, fitted so perfectly into the wall that it disappeared. She went to the kitchen, came back with a butter knife, worked it into the seam. The panel popped loose with a sound like a gasp, revealing a space behind the wall, dark, small, and inside, a box. Metal, the size of a shoebox, covered in rust and dust and time. Martha's hands shook as she pulled it out. Her heart was doing something strange in her chest, that irregular rhythm the doctor had warned her about. The kind that meant, slow down, be careful, remember you're not young anymore. She carried the box to the table, set it down beside the cedar branch, and just stared at it for a long moment. Part of her didn't want to open it. Part of her knew that whatever was inside would change things, would make the impossible more impossible, would give weight to questions she didn't want answered. But Martha Goodwin had never been one to turn away from truth, no matter how strange it tasted. So she opened the box. Inside, a journal. Leather-bound, pages yellowed and brittle. Frank's handwriting. A jar empty now, but the label still visible. Wildflower honey, and something else. A photograph. Black and white, faded, but clear enough. Frank, maybe 40 years old, standing in front of the cabin. And beside him, barely coming up to his shoulder, a small figure, covered in dark hair. Eyes reflecting the camera flash. A child. Not human, but not animal either. Martha's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she opened the journal, and Frank's voice, his real voice, the one she'd thought she'd never hear again, rose from the pages. The 15th of May, 1971. I'm writing this down because I don't think anyone will believe it. Hell, I don't believe it. And I was there. But Martha's visiting her sister in Bozeman, and I got time, so here goes. Found a kid in the woods today. Least I think it was a kid. Hard to say. Caught in an old bear trap about 3 miles north of the cabin, up near Widow's Ridge. Been there a while, judging by the blood. It was making sounds I never heard before, not quite crying, not quite animal. Something in between. I thought about leaving it. That's the truth. Thought about turning around and pretending I never saw nothing, because I knew, soon as I laid eyes on it, what it was. What people say lives up in these mountains. What the old-timers tell stories about over whiskey when they think nobody's listening. But it looked at me, and in those eyes, I saw Danny. Saw my son, 5 years old, looking up at me with trust that said, "Fix this, Dad. You can fix anything." So I fixed it. Cut the trap off, cleaned the wound best I could, carried it back here. It weighed maybe 80 pounds, all muscle and terror. Kept expecting it to fight, to bite, to run, but it didn't. Just laid there in my arms, like it had been waiting for someone to come along, like it knew I would. Kept it in the shed for 3 days. Martha thinks I'm building shelves. Fed it honey and bread and apples from the cellar. Changed the bandages twice a day. Talked to it like I used to talk to Danny when he was small, before he got too old to need his dad's voice to feel safe. 3rd day, the wound looked better. Good enough, anyway. Led it to the tree line, pointed north, gave it the rest of the honey jar to take along. It looked at me for a long time before it left. Then it did something I'll never forget. It touched my chest, right over my heart, then touched its own. I'm writing this down so if anything happens to me, Martha will know, will understand. Because I got a feeling can't explain it. Just know it in my bones that this isn't over. That something started today that's gonna reach forward into time I won't see. And Martha needs to know. Needs to understand why. Some debts get paid in years, not days. Some promises take a lifetime to keep. If you're reading this, Martha, and I'm not there anymore. Trust what comes knocking, even if it don't make sense, even if it scares you, because 20 years ago, I saved something that shouldn't exist. And now, whenever now, is it's time for that debt to come due. Martha sat at the table, Frank's journal open in front of her, tears running down her face unchecked. The cabin was silent, except for her breathing, except for the tick of the clock, except for the sound of a heart breaking and mending at the same time. "You son of a bitch," she whispered, but she was smiling. "You beautiful, stupid, impossible son of a bitch." Because now she understood. The 3 knocks, the 2 creatures on her porch. The way the taller one had watched her with those ancient eyes. Not wondering if she could be trusted, wondering if she knew, if she remembered, if she understood the debt that was being paid. The taller one wasn't just any Bigfoot. It was the child, Frank's child, grown now, a leader, probably. Old enough to remember the man who'd saved it. Old enough to come back when it found 2 young ones lost in a blizzard and knew exactly where to bring them. To the cabin where kindness lived, where a man had once chosen mercy over fear, where his widow, even if she didn't know the full story, would do the same. Martha closed the journal carefully, set it beside the cedar branch, and looked at the photograph again. Frank's smile was the one she remembered. Young, strong, certain. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing you did the right thing, even if nobody would ever believe you. "I believe you," she said to the photograph. "Wherever you are, Frank Goodwin, I believe every word." Outside, the afternoon was wearing into evening. The sun dropped toward the mountains, painting everything gold and violet. And somewhere up in the high country, in the spaces between trees where maps gave up and names didn't matter, a tribe watched the cabin in the valley, watched the smoke rise from the chimney, watched the lights come on against the gathering dark, watched and remembered, and knew that some debts, the ones that matter, are always paid in full. 3 weeks passed. The snow melted slow, revealing mud, and last year's leaves and all the secrets winter had buried. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was coming. You could smell it in the air, that mineral scent of earth waking up, of things deciding to live again. Martha kept to her routine: coffee at dawn, chores, reading, cooking meals, for one that always felt like they were meant for two. But something had shifted inside her, some weight redistributed. The cabin didn't feel so empty anymore. Even when she was alone, especially when she was alone, she could feel them out there, watching, present. It should have been creepy, should have made her nervous, but it wasn't. It didn't. It felt like family, like having someone who'd check in on her, make sure she was okay, keep an eye out without getting in the way. She started leaving things on the porch, not every night, just sometimes. Bread wrapped in cloth, apples from the cellar. Once, when she'd made too much stew, she put it in an old pot by the steps with a spoon stuck in it. By morning, it was always gone. The pot cleaned, the cloth folded. Sometimes there'd be something left in return. Firewood, split and stacked neat. Kindling gathered and bundled. Once, a deer already dressed and hung, fresh enough the blood was still tacky. Martha never saw them, but she felt them, and that was enough. Then one night in mid-March, when the moon was full and the air had that electric feeling that comes before things change, she heard it again. 3 knocks. Martha was in her nightgown, teeth out, hair in the silk cap she wore to bed. 10:47 p.m., according to the clock. Too late for neighbors, even if she had neighbors within 5 miles. Too late for anyone with good intentions. But she knew those knocks, recognized the rhythm, the deliberation. She opened the door. The taller one stood on the porch. Frank's child. She thought of him now. And beside him was another. Older, bigger, female, Martha thought, though it was hard to say for certain. And in this one's eyes was something different. Not curiosity, not desperation, recognition, authority, judgment. The matriarch, Martha realized. The leader, come to see for herself the woman who'd taken in their young, who'd fed them, sheltered them, sent them home safe. Come to decide if Martha Goodwin could be trusted, or if the debt Frank started 20 years ago had been paid in full. Martha stepped aside without a word. The two entered slowly, the matriarch's eyes taking in everything. The cabin, the photographs, the cedar branch on the table, the journal Martha hadn't bothered hiding. The matriarch moved to the table, picked up the cedar branch little Cedar had left, turned it over in her massive hands. Then she saw the photograph, Frank and the child, evidence of a kindness given when it didn't have to be, proof of a bond that had shaped everything that came after. She set the branch down carefully, then turned to Martha, and in her eyes was something that made Martha's throat tight. Not gratitude, that was too small a word. What lived in those eyes was recognition, kinship, the understanding that passes between mothers, between women who've buried children, between survivors who know what it costs to keep living when everything you love has been taken. The matriarch reached into a pouch, woven from bark and grass, hanging at her hip, and pulled something out. A bracelet, braided cedar and pine, woven so tight it gleamed in the lamplight. She stepped forward, and Martha held out her hand, not sure what was happening, but certain it was important. The matriarch tied the bracelet around Martha's wrist. Not tight, not loose, perfect. Then she did something that made time stop. She pulled her sleeve back. Yes, they wore clothes, rough leather, and hide, and showed her own wrist. The same bracelet, the same pattern, the same promise. She touched Martha's chest, right over her heart, then touched her own. You are one of us now. You are protected. You are Pack. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to stop. Thank you, she whispered. The matriarch nodded once. Then she reached behind her back and pulled out something else. A small carved figure. Wood, old wood, polished smooth by years of handling. A nest, the size a child might need. A symbol of safety, of home. She set it on the table beside the cedar branch, beside Frank's journal, beside the photograph of a man, and a creature who'd started a story neither of them could finish alone. And then they were gone. Into the night, into the trees, into the spaces between shadows where things older than memory still lived, and moved and kept their promises. Martha stood at the door for a long time after, the bracelet warm on her wrist, the carved nest heavy in her hand. Outside, the moon was so bright she could see her own shadow stretched long across the snow, and somewhere far above, in the high places where the mountains touched the sky, she heard it. 3 knocks echoing through the valleys. Clear, certain, final. A debt paid, a circle closed, a promise kept. She went inside, locked the door, and sat at the table with a cup of tea she didn't drink. The cabin was quiet, but not empty. Never empty again, because now Martha understood what Frank had known all those years ago. Some things transcend species, transcend reason, transcend everything we think we know about how the world works. Kindness recognizes kindness. Mercy remembers mercy. And sometimes, when you open a door to something terrifying, you find something sacred instead. Martha Goodwin, 68 years old, widow, survivor, believer in impossible things, touched the bracelet on her wrist and smiled. "We did good, Frank," she said to the photograph. "We did real good." And somewhere in the dark, in the spaces between trees, between heartbeats, between moments, something answered. Not with words, not with sound, but with presence, with promise, with the certainty that comes from knowing you're not alone. Not anymore, not ever again. Spring came slow that year, but it came. The snow retreated up the mountains like a defeated army, leaving behind mud and new grass, and the smell of earth remembering how to breathe. The creek behind Martha's cabin swelled with meltwater, rushing and tumbling over rocks that had been silent all winter. Birds returned, robins and jays, and the woodpeckers that made Frank curse every morning when they hammered on the metal roof. Martha turned 69 in April. No cake, no candles, no phone calls from relatives who'd stopped checking in years ago. Just another day, except she woke to find a circle of stones arranged on her porch. Perfect circle. Each stone, smooth and round, placed with intention. In the center, fresh wildflowers. Mountain lupine, Indian paintbrush, columbine that wouldn't bloom naturally for another month. She stood there in her bathrobe, coffee steaming in the morning cold, and felt something break open in her chest. Not sadness, not quite joy, something that lived in the space between, where gratitude and grief shake hands and agree to coexist. "Thank you," she said to the trees, to the morning, to whatever had left this gift. "Thank you." The bracelet on her wrist caught the light, and she twisted it gently, feeling the cedar rough against her skin. She hadn't taken it off since the matriarch had tied it there. Wore it in the shower, wore it to bed, wore it like a wedding ring or a promise you couldn't break even if you wanted to. Life settled into a new rhythm. Martha still lived alone, still woke to empty rooms and coffee for one. But the loneliness had changed texture. It wasn't absence anymore. It was solitude. And solitude, she was learning, could be peaceful if you let it. She started walking more. Her joints still complained arthritis didn't care that spring had come, but she ignored them. Every afternoon, weather permitting, she'd take Frank's old walking stick and head out along the deer trails that wound through the woods. Never far, maybe a mile, mile and a half, but far enough to see things, notice things. The tracks were everywhere once you knew how to look. Massive prints pressed deep into soft earth. Broken branches at heights no human could reach. Stones stacked in patterns that meant something, though Martha couldn't always decode the message. She was never alone on these walks, never saw them directly, but she could feel the presence, the watching, not threatening, protective, like having a guardian angel. If guardian angels were 8 feet tall and covered in hair. One afternoon in May, Martha was maybe a mile from the cabin when she heard voices, human voices, male, loud. Coming from the ridge above, she froze. Her heart kicked into that irregular rhythm again, the one that made her stop and breathe deep. Count to 10. Remember that panic solved nothing. The voices got closer, crashing through underbrush, laughing, talking in that way men do when they think they own whatever space they occupy. Martha moved off the trail, tucked herself behind a fallen log, not hiding, just being smart, being careful. 3 of them appeared on the ridge, young, maybe 30, 35, dressed in expensive hiking gear, the kind you buy at REI without checking the price tag, carrying cameras with lenses long as your arm, and something else. Rifles, not hunting rifles, big caliber, tactical-looking things that had no business in these woods. I'm telling you, the tracks were fresh, one of them said. He was tall, blonde, had that confidence that comes from never being told no. 2 days old, max, headed north toward that valley. If we can get proof, another one said. Shorter, darker, scar across his cheek. We're talking book deals, man. TV shows. This is Bigfoot. Actual, documented Bigfoot. The third one, built like a linebacker, spat tobacco juice on the ground. And if we can't get proof, well, he patted his rifle. Taxidermist in Billings owes me a favor. Bodies just as good as photos. Better, even. Martha's blood went cold. They were hunters. Not the kind looking for deer or elk. The kind looking for trophies. For proof. For something to kill and stuff and mount on a wall so they could tell stories at parties about how brave they were. They moved past her hiding spot, headed downslope toward the valley, toward the territory she'd come to think of as sacred ground, toward the tribe that had shown her more kindness than most humans ever had. Martha waited until they were out of sight, then moved as fast as her old legs would carry her. Back to the cabin. Her breath came hard and ragged, her chest tight. The walking stick caught on roots, and she stumbled twice, caught herself both times on hands that tomorrow would be bruised and angry. She burst through the cabin door, grabbed the shotgun, checked the load, 2 shells. She had more in the closet, but her hands were shaking too hard to load them. 2 would have to be enough. Then she stopped, stood there in her kitchen, breathing hard, the gun heavy in her hands, and thought about Frank, about the journal, about the choice he'd made 20 years ago when he could have walked away, could have left that child to die in the trap, could have decided it wasn't his problem. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. Okay, Martha said to the empty cabin, to Frank's ghost, to whatever was listening. Okay, she set the shotgun by the door. Then she went to the kitchen and grabbed every pot and pan she owned, her big iron skillet, the Dutch oven, the metal mixing bowls, the old cowbell Frank used to ring when dinner was ready, back when Danny was small and playing too far from the house to hear him calling. She carried them all outside, arranged them in a rough circle in the clearing behind the cabin. Then she picked up the walking stick and started banging. The sound was god-awful, clanging and ringing and echoing off the mountains like the world's worst percussion section, loud enough to wake the dead, loud enough to be heard for miles. She banged until her arms ached, until the irregular rhythm in her chest became regular again from sheer stubbornness, until she was certain the message had been received. Danger, hunters, run. Then she stopped, leaned on the walking stick, breathing hard, and listened. For a long moment, nothing, just wind in the trees. The creek rushing, a jay scolding from somewhere overhead, then distant, but clear 3 knocks. Deliberate, echoing, not from one direction, from several, north, west, east. Message received. We understand. We'll be careful. Martha went back inside, legs shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She made tea with trembling hands, sat at the table, and tried to think. Those men had rifles, had training, probably, had determination fueled by greed and ego, and the kind of certainty that comes from never having been truly afraid. The tribe had wisdom, had numbers, had survived in these mountains for generations, maybe centuries, but they'd survived by staying hidden, by avoiding contact, by disappearing when humans got too close. What happened when hiding wasn't enough? She didn't sleep that night. sat in the rocking chair with the shotgun across her lap, watching the tree line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The moon rose full and bright, turning everything silver and strange. Shadows moved in the woods, but shadows always moved. Didn't mean anything, except one shadow was too big, too deliberate, too human-shaped but wrong somehow. Martha's finger found the trigger, then relaxed. She knew that shadow. The matriarch stepped into the clearing, moonlight painting her in shades of gray and silver. She moved with impossible silence for something so large, crossing the distance between the trees and the porch in seconds. She didn't knock, just stood there, waiting, and Martha understood the message. "May I enter?" Martha opened the door. The matriarch came inside, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller, the ceilings lower, the walls closer. She moved to the table, picked up Frank's journal like she knew exactly what it was, and opened it carefully. Her fingers massive, tipped with nails like claws, turned the pages gently, reverently. She couldn't read, Martha realized. The words meant nothing to her, but she understood what the journal represented. Memory, record, proof that what happened 20 years ago had been real, had mattered, had set everything that came after into motion. The matriarch set the journal down, then looked at Martha. In her eyes was a question, also a statement, also a promise. "You warned us. Now we must warn you. This is dangerous. For all of us." "I know," Martha said. Her voice sounded small in the quiet cabin. "But I couldn't let them." She stopped, tried again. "Frank saved your child. You saved mine, in a way. When you brought those two young ones here, you gave me something to care about again, something to protect. I won't let these men destroy that." The matriarch studied her for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not much. Her face wasn't built for human expressions, but something that looked enough like a smile to count. She reached out and touched the bracelet on Martha's wrist. Then she touched her own. Then she touched Martha's chest, over her heart, and Martha understood. Pack protects pack. Family protects family. We will handle this together. Then she was gone, into the night, into the shadows, back to wherever the tribe lived, in the high country where maps gave up and humans feared to go. Martha sat alone again, but not lonely. Never lonely, not anymore. She loaded the shotgun, both barrels, then loaded her pockets with shells. Put on her boots, her thick jacket. Filled a thermos with coffee that would stay hot for hours. Then she settled into the rocking chair, the shotgun across her lap, and waited for whatever morning would bring. Dawn came slow and red. Sailor's warning, Martha's mother used to say. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Meant weather was changing. Meant trouble was coming. Martha made coffee, ate toast she didn't taste, checked the shotgun for the third time, even though she knew it was loaded. The cabin felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still. Like the moment before a storm breaks when everything goes silent, and you just know that the world's about to change. She was washing her breakfast dishes when she heard the first shot. Distant, maybe 2 miles north. Sharp crack of a high-powered rifle, unmistakable. Her hands froze in the soapy water. Another shot, then another, then silence. Martha dried her hands on a dish towel, grabbed the shotgun, and headed out. She shouldn't have. She was 69 years old with arthritis and a heart that skipped beats and no business playing hero in the mountains. Should have called Sheriff Rawlings, except the phone lines had been down since the last storm and her cell got no signal out here. Should have stayed inside, locked the doors, let whatever happened happen without her. But Martha Goodwin had never been good at should-haves. She followed the sound, moving as fast as her legs would allow, the walking stick in one hand and the shotgun in the other. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind had stopped, like nature itself was holding its breath. She found them in a clearing maybe 3 miles from her cabin. The 3 hunters stood in a rough triangle, rifles raised, pointing at something Martha couldn't see at first. They were shouting at each other, voices high and scared in a way that said whatever they'd found had turned out to be more than they'd bargained for. Jesus Christ, how many are there? I count 6. No, 8 shit. They're everywhere. Take the shot, take the shot. Martha burst into the clearing, shotgun raised. Don't you dare. All 3 men spun, rifles swinging toward her, and for a second one, terrible second, she thought this was how it ended. 69 years old, shot by idiots in the woods, dying for creatures that shouldn't exist. But they didn't shoot, just stared at her like she'd materialized out of thin air. Lady, what the hell are you doing out here? The blonde one, the confident one, lowered his rifle slightly. This is dangerous. There are. I know what there are, Martha said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. And you need to leave. Now. Are you crazy? The scarred one laughed, but it was a nervous sound. We're not leaving. Do you understand what we've found? This is proof. This is sacred ground, Martha said, and you're trespassing. Sacred ground? The big one, the linebacker, spat. Lady, this is national forest, public land. We got every right to be here. Rights. Martha laughed, and even she could hear the edge in it. You talk about rights while pointing rifles at creatures that were here long before this country, before your great-grandparents, before anyone thought to draw lines on a map and call it ownership. Movement in the trees, all around them. Shadows that were too big, too deliberate, too aware. Martha could feel them, the tribe, circling, watching, waiting to see how this played out. The matriarch stepped into view first, then 2 others, then 4 more, then so many Martha lost count. They emerged from the shadows like they were made of shadows, surrounding the clearing, eyes reflecting the morning light, silent, patient, terrifying. The 3 hunters moved closer together, rifles shaking now, all that confidence evaporating like mist in sunlight. Holy shit, the blonde one whispered. Holy shit, they're real. They're actually real. Lower your weapons, Martha said. Slowly, put them on the ground. Like hell, the linebacker started. Do it, Martha said, and she pointed the shotgun at his chest. Or I will blow a hole in you big enough to see daylight through. And trust me, these creatures won't stop me. They'll probably thank me. The blonde one was smart enough to read the situation. He set his rifle down carefully. After a moment, the scarred one did the same. The linebacker held out longest, but when the matriarch took 1 step forward, just one, but it said everything, he dropped his rifle like it was on fire. Good, Martha said. Now, back away. Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them. They backed up, stumbling over roots, eyes never leaving the tribe. The creatures didn't move, just stood there, forming a wall of muscle and fur and ancient patience. You can't tell anyone about this, Martha said. You understand me? Nobody can know. Are you kidding? The scarred one's voice cracked. This is the discovery of the century. We have to ding. You have to shut your mouth and forget you ever came here, Martha said. Because if you don't, if you bring people back here, bring cameras and scientists, and every idiot with a gun looking to make a name for themselves, these creatures will disappear, and you'll have destroyed something precious for nothing but ego. But, no buts. Martha's finger tightened on the trigger. You go back. You tell people you didn't find anything. You let this remain a mystery, or I swear on my husband's grave, I will make sure you regret it. The matriarch made a sound then, low, guttural. Not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something that translated perfectly in any language. Leave. Now. Or we make you leave. The 3 men ran, left their rifles, left their cameras, left their dignity scattered across the clearing like spent shell casings. Just ran, crashing through the underbrush, stumbling and falling, and picking themselves up and running again. Martha listened until she couldn't hear them anymore, until the forest started breathing again, until the birds came back, and the squirrels resumed their gossip. Then she lowered the shotgun. Her hands were shaking now, reaction setting in, and she had to lean on the walking stick to stay upright. The matriarch approached slowly, stopped a few feet away, studied Martha with those ancient eyes that had seen things no human would ever understand. Then she did something Martha would remember for the rest of her life. She reached out with one massive hand and gently, so gently touched Martha's face, just rested her palm against Martha's cheek, thumb brushing away a tear Martha hadn't realized was falling. "Thank you. You are brave. You are fierce. You are worthy." Martha covered the matriarch's hand with her own. "You would have done the same for me." Not a question, a certainty. Because that's what family did. That's what pack meant. You protected each other, even when it was dangerous, even when it was stupid, even when every logical bone in your body screamed that you should mind your own business and stay safe. The matriarch nodded. Then she picked up the 3 rifles, held them in her hands like they were toys, and snapped them. Just broke them in half like they were made of kindling. She dropped the pieces on the ground, then gestured for the others to follow. They disappeared back into the shadows, and within seconds, it was like they'd never been there at all, except for the broken rifles. And the certainty in Martha's bones that something had changed, some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. She walked back to her cabin slowly, every step an effort, her heart doing that skip-jump thing that said she'd pushed too hard, gone too far. But she made it, stumbled through the door, set the shotgun down, collapsed into the rocking chair. Her whole body was shaking now. Adrenaline crash. Fear she'd been too pumped up to feel while it was happening. The knowledge that she'd pointed a gun at another human being, and meant it, would have pulled the trigger if she'd had to. "What have I become?" she whispered to the empty cabin. But she knew. She'd become what Frank had been 20 years ago. Someone who saw something worth saving and decided the risk was worth it. Someone who understood that mercy wasn't weakness, that kindness could be fierce, that sometimes the measure of a soul was whether you had the courage to do the right thing, even when it was the hard thing. She sat there, rocking until her heartbeat slowed, until her hands stopped shaking, until the cabin stopped spinning. Then she made tea, sat at the table, and wrote her own entry in Frank's journal. The 15th of May 1991. 20 years to the day since Frank saved that child. 20 years, and the debt came full circle. I held a gun on 3 men today. Would have shot them if they'd forced me. Never thought I'd be that person. Never wanted to be, but I am. And I'm not sorry. Frank, if you're out there somewhere, if you can hear me, I hope I made you proud. I hope you're looking down and nodding that way you used to when I did something right. I hope you understand why. They're my family now. Strange as that sounds, these creatures that shouldn't exist, that the world says are myths, they're more real to me than most humans I've known. More loyal, more true. I'm 69 years old. My heart skips, my joints ache. Every morning I wake up is a gift I didn't earn, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left protecting this. Protecting them, because that's what family does. Love you, Frank. Always did. Always will. Martha, she closed the journal, set it beside the cedar branch and the carved nest, and looked at the photograph one more time. Frank smiled back at her from across the years, and Martha could almost hear his voice. You did good, Martha. Real good. Outside, the afternoon wore into evening. The sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple and that particular shade of gold that only happens in spring. And somewhere up in the high country, 3 knocks echoed across the valleys. Clear, certain, grateful. Martha smiled, touched the bracelet on her wrist, and whispered, "You're welcome." The days that followed were quiet. No more hunters appeared. No helicopters flew overhead. No search parties combed the woods. Either the 3 men had taken Martha's warning to heart, or they'd been too embarrassed to admit what they'd seen. Either way, the mountains returned to their usual rhythms. Snow melted, flowers bloomed, life went on. Martha's routine shifted. She started leaving food out more regularly, not every night, but most nights. Bread and honey, dried meat, apples. whatever she could spare, and every morning it was gone, replaced by gifts she couldn't have bought in any store. Firewood, so much firewood, split and stacked so neatly it looked like art. Wild herbs tied in bundles, sage and yarrow, and plants she didn't recognize, but that smelled like medicine. Once, a perfect elk hide, tanned soft, big enough for a blanket. They were taking care of her. She understood that, making sure she had what she needed, checking in, watching over. The way family does when one of their own is getting older, slowing down, maybe not going to be around forever. And Martha was slowing down. She could feel it. Not suddenly, but gradually, like watching ice melt. The arthritis was worse this year. Her heart skipped more often. She got tired easier, needed more rest, found herself sitting down in the middle of tasks that used to be simple. She was dying. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, relatively speaking. A year, 2, 5 if she was lucky, and careful and modern medicine cooperated. Didn't matter. The certainty was there, sitting in her chest alongside all the other certainties she'd learned to carry. One evening in July, when the air was soft and the fireflies were out, and the whole world smelled like pine and possibility, Martha sat on her porch with a glass of wine, doctor said no alcohol, but the hell with that, and watched the sunset paint the mountains. She heard them before she saw them. That particular silence, that meant something large, was moving carefully, trying not to scare her. Then they emerged from the tree line. Not just the matriarch this time, the whole tribe. Or most of it anyway. Maybe 20, 25, adults, young ones. Even the 2 she'd sheltered back in January, little Cedar, and the taller one, both looking healthy and strong and whole. They didn't approach the cabin, just arranged themselves in the clearing, forming a loose circle, and sat down, patient, waiting. Martha set down her wine glass, stood up slowly, knees popping, back complaining, and walked down the porch steps. The grass was cool under her bare feet, still damp from the afternoon rain. She walked to the center of the clearing, turned slowly, looking at each of them. Family, all of them, every single one. The matriarch stood, moved forward, and Martha met her halfway. They stood there for a long moment, woman and creature, human and something beyond human, just looking at each other with the kind of understanding that needs no translation. The matriarch reached out and took Martha's hand. Her palm was rough, calloused from years of surviving in these mountains, but her touch was gentle. She pulled Martha forward, into the circle, and gestured for her to sit. Martha, Saturday, right there on the damp grass, cross-legged like she used to sit when Danny was small and they'd have picnics by the creek. The tribe moved closer, tightening the circle around her. Not threatening, embracing, and then they began to sing. That's the only word for it. Not music, exactly. Not in any way humans would recognize, but sound that had structure, rhythm, meaning. Deep bass notes that vibrated in Martha's chest, higher notes that sounded almost like wolves, mid-range sounds that could have been whales, if whales lived in mountains instead of oceans. It rose and fell like waves, like breathing, like the earth itself was singing through them. And Martha understood, bone deep, what this was. A ceremony, a ritual, a way of saying goodbye and thank you, and we will remember you all at once. Because they knew, somehow they knew, that Martha was dying, that her time was running short. And this was their way of honoring that, of acknowledging her place in their story, of making sure she understood that what she'd done, the doors she'd opened, the guns she'd held, the choice she'd made to see them as family instead of monsters mattered. Tears ran down Martha's face, but she didn't wipe them away. Just sat there in the center of the circle, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, listening to music that had no name, feeling more connected to the universe than she'd ever felt in church or anywhere else humans gathered to try to touch the divine. The song lasted until the stars came out, until the moon rose full and bright, until Martha's legs went numb and her back ached, and none of it mattered because this moment, this feeling, this connection, was what she'd been looking for her whole life without knowing it. When the song ended, the silence felt sacred. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, just breathing, just being. Then little Cedar, bigger now, but still smaller than the others, approached Martha. In his hands was something wrapped in leaves. He knelt in front of her, carefully unwrapped it, and showed her. Seeds. Maybe 24 of them, each one the size of her thumb, dark and smooth and ancient looking. Little Cedar took Martha's hand, turned it palm up, and placed the seeds in it, one by one. Each placement deliberate, ceremonial. When all the seeds were nestled in her palm, he closed her fingers around them and held her fist in both his hands. He spoke then, not words, but sounds that Martha understood anyway, the way you understand music or crying or laughter, without needing translation. Plant these, they will grow. Long after you're gone, they will be here. A bridge between your world and ours. A reminder of what we shared. Martha nodded, throat too tight to speak. She clutched the seeds, felt their weight, their potential, their promise. The tribe stood. One by one, they approached Martha. Each one touched her shoulder, hand, head. Brief contacts that said more than words ever could. Thank you. Goodbye. We'll remember. Then they faded back into the shadows, into the forest, into the spaces between trees where magic still lived. The matriarch was last. She cupped Martha's face in both hands, leaned down, and pressed her forehead to Martha's. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, heartbeats synchronizing. Then the matriarch pulled back, touched the bracelet on Martha's wrist, smiled, that almost smile, and was gone. Martha sat alone in the clearing, seeds clutched in her hand, tears drying on her face, feeling more full than empty, more grateful than sad, more connected than alone. She slept on the porch that night, wrapped in the elk hide they'd given her, watching the stars wheel overhead. And she dreamed of Frank, young and strong and laughing. Dreamed of Danny, running through the woods with little Cedar chasing him, both of them shrieking with joy. Dreamed of a future where the seeds grew into trees, and the trees held stories, and the stories kept alive the memory of a woman who'd chosen kindness over fear. Autumn came. The aspens turned gold. The mountains dressed themselves in fire, and the air took on that quality it only has in fall, crisp and clear, and so bright it hurt your eyes. Martha planted the seeds, not all in one place, but scattered, some near the cabin, some by the creek, some along the trails she used to walk. She dug holes with arthritic hands, placed each seed carefully, covered them with earth, and said a little prayer to whatever was listening. Grow, she whispered. Grow and remember. Grow and be proof. Grow and keep the story alive. She didn't know if they'd take, didn't know what they'd grow into, but she had faith. The kind of faith that has nothing to do with churches or doctrine and everything to do with trust. With belief in things you can't see yet but know in your bones are real. The harvest moon rose full and orange, hanging low over the mountains like a promise. Martha sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets, the elk hide across her lap, and watched it climb the sky. She wasn't afraid, not of dying, not of leaving, not of what came next. She'd done what she came here to do, had answered the knock when it came, had chosen mercy, had protected something precious, had been part of a story bigger than herself. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The first snow came in October. Just a dusting, nothing serious, but enough to remind her that winter was coming. The cycle continuing, life moving forward whether she was here to see it or not. Martha was sitting at the table, writing letters to Sheriff Rawlings, to the few distant relatives she still had, to the lawyer in Missoula who'd handled Frank's will when she heard it. 3 knocks. She smiled, set down her pen, walked slowly to the door, and opened it. The matriarch stood on the porch, and beside her were little Cedar and the taller one whose name Martha had never learned. In little Cedar's hands was something wrapped in bark. "Come in," Martha said. "Please." They entered, ducking under the doorframe, moving with that impossible grace, that something so large should never possess. The matriarch looked around the cabin like she was memorizing it, recording every detail, making sure she'd be able to tell the story later. Little Cedar approached Martha and handed her the bark-wrapped package. She opened it carefully. Inside was a book. Not a real book, but something like it. Pages made of bark, stitched together with sinew. And on each page, drawings, pictures carved and painted with what looked like berry juice and charcoal and blood. The story, their story, starting with Frank and the child in the trap, moving through the years, the child growing, becoming the matriarch, finding the two young ones lost in the blizzard, bringing them to Martha's door. 3 knocks, the circle closing. The last page showed Martha, recognizable despite the crude drawing, standing between the human world and their world, a bridge, a connection, a guardian of secrets. "It's beautiful," Martha whispered. "Thank you." The matriarch touched Martha's chest, then her own. The same gesture she'd made that first night. But now Martha understood all the layers of meaning. You are us. We are you. What we shared transcends everything that says we should be enemies. You proved that kindness is stronger than fear, and we will never forget. They stayed for an hour, sitting by the fire, not speaking, just being together. When they left, Martha stood at the door and watched them disappear into the trees. She knew somehow. She knew this was the last time, the last visit, the last goodbye. She went back inside, sat at the table, and added one final entry to Frank's journal. The 15th of October, 1991. They came tonight, said goodbye without saying it. Gave me a gift I'll treasure till my last breath. If you're reading this, whoever you are, know this, they're real. They exist, and they're worth protecting, not because they're special, though they are. Not because they're mysterious, though they are that too. But because they reminded me what it means to be human, real human, the kind that chooses compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, love over fear. I'm tired now, so tired. But I'm not sad. I got to be part of something miraculous. Got to see behind the veil. Got to understand that the world is bigger and stranger and more beautiful than we've ever imagined. Frank, I'm coming to find you. Wait for me. We've got stories to catch up on. And to whoever finds this journal, take care of them, watch over them, keep the secret. Because some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Some magic is meant to stay magic. And some connections are too precious to let the world destroy. Martha, Goodwin. She closed the journal, set it beside the cedar branch, and the carved nest, and the bark book, and walked to her bedroom. Her heart was doing that skip-jump thing, but worse now, painful, insistent, telling her time was running out. She lay down on the bed, pulled the elk hide over herself, closed her eyes, and smiled. "I'm ready," she whispered. They found her 3 weeks later. Sheriff Rawlings, responding to the letters she'd sent. He knocked on the door 3 times, out of habit, and when nobody answered, he let himself in. Martha Goodwin lay peaceful in her bed, wrapped in a hide he couldn't identify, a bracelet of woven cedar on her wrist, a smile on her face. Natural causes, the coroner said. Heart just gave out, probably went in her sleep, didn't suffer. On her table, Sheriff Rawlings found the journal. The photographs, the cedar branch, still green somehow despite months without water, the carved nest. And something else, a book made of bark, covered in drawings that made his skin prickle with recognition and fear and wonder. He should have turned it all over to the authorities, should have called in experts, should have done his job by the book. Instead, he took the journal, the photographs, the bark book, locked them in a safe at his house, and never told anyone what he'd found. Because Martha's final entry had been clear. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysterious. Some magic is meant to stay magic. Some secrets are worth keeping. They buried her next to Frank, up on the hill overlooking the valley. Small ceremony. Few people came, most who'd known her were already gone. Sheriff Rawlings said a few words. The minister from the church in town said the usual prayers. And afterward, when everyone had left, when the sun was setting and the shadows were getting long, Sheriff Rawlings saw them. Standing at the tree line, maybe 20 of them, maybe more, watching, bearing witness, saying goodbye in their own way. He didn't tell anyone about that either. The seeds grew. Over the years, they became trees. Strange trees, unlike anything else in the forest. Taller, stronger, with bark that shimmered in certain lights, and leaves that sang in certain winds. Scientists came to study them once, took samples, ran tests, found nothing unusual except that they shouldn't exist. The species was unknown. The DNA was impossible. The growth rate defied explanation. The scientists left, confused and frustrated. The trees remained, and on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind is right, people in Cedar Hollow swear they can hear something in those trees. Not quite singing, not quite speaking, but something, a rhythm, a remembering. 3 knocks, echoing through the branches. Some say it's just the wind. Others say it's the trees themselves, grown from seeds given in love, holding stories in their roots. A few the ones who knew Martha, who remember her kindness, her fierceness, her refusal to turn away from the impossible. They say it's something else. A reminder, a promise, proof that sometimes, when we open our doors to the strange and the terrifying and the unknown, we find something sacred instead. The cabin still stands. No one lives there now. It's been 40 years, give or take. But hikers who pass it swear they smell fresh bread sometimes, hear rocking chairs creaking, see smoke rising from the chimney even though there's no fire. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to approach the porch, you'll find offerings. Fresh firewood, wild herbs, stones arranged in circles, cedar branches, always cedar, woven into patterns that mean something to those who understand. The tribe is still there, still surviving, still remembering, watching from the shadows, keeping the promise, guarding the trees that grew from Martha's seeds. Because some debts take lifetimes to pay. Some promises outlast the ones who made them. And some stories, the ones that matter, the ones that change us, they don't end just because the people in them do. They continue. They grow. They become part of the land, part of the trees, part of the wind that moves through the mountains on quiet nights when the moon is full and the world pauses to remember. Martha Goodwin answered the knock, chose compassion over fear, opened her door to the impossible, and in doing so, she became something more than herself. More than one life, one person, one moment. She became a story, a legend, a reminder that the measure of a soul isn't in how long you live, but in what you do when something terrified and desperate and utterly strange knocks on your door in the middle of a blizzard. Do you close it? Lock it? Pretend you didn't hear? Or do you step aside and say, quietly but with absolute certainty, come on in, you'll freeze out there. Martha chose kindness, and in choosing kindness, she found family, found purpose, found meaning that outlasted her body, her breath, her time. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happened in Cedar Hollow, Montana, in the winter of 1991. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But the trees are still growing. The tribe is still there. And on certain nights, when the wind is right, you can still hear it. 3 knocks echoing through the darkness. Clear, certain, eternal, answering back.